Welcome back everybody to part 2 of the Weird Gun Iceberg series. In my last video I covered some wacky firearms made throughout history, and today we're going to look at a couple more. If you missed part 1, I'll obviously have it linked in the description below, so be sure to catch up. And just as a reminder for those of you that couldn't tell, English is my primary language, so if there's a gun or a name from another country or culture that I don't pronounce perfectly, first off, I'm sorry, and second of all, please have some grace. But before any of you come at me in the comments again, it's pronounced Heckler and Koch, not however I so confidently said it last time.
Heckler and Koch.
But from now on, just to be safe, I'll refer to them as H and K. Now, level 2 of the iceberg is still going to be made up of guns that most people will probably know at least something about. Many of you will probably recognize some of these guns and say to yourself, oh, I've seen it in that one movie or video game. On the higher levels of the iceberg, I'm more concerned with the unique design of the guns I talk about and less with their actual obscurity, so chances are you're probably familiar with a lot of these if you watch a lot of action movies or play a lot of shooter games. But really all that matters is that I get to talk about a group of goofy guns that I think are neat and interesting, so let's get started. First off, we have two shotguns designed by Robert Hilberg in the 1960s, the Winchester Liberator and the Colt Defender. The Liberator was essentially an incredibly scaled up version of a 4-barrel Derringer pistol. Hilberg built the guns with simplicity and ease of use in mind, and in the case of the Liberator, the idea was that they could serve very much the same purpose of the FP45 Liberator pistol from World War II that I talked about on the first level of the iceberg. Now, shotguns don't exactly take a whole lot of skill to use effectively, and Hilberg envisioned a weapon that could be cheaply manufactured and supplied to freedom fighters in places like Vietnam or Cuba and allow them to get an edge on their oppressors even if they had never even held a gun before. The Liberator shotgun was loaded like a regular break barrel shotgun by turning the barrels downward and away from the breech block. The firing pin was attached to a rotating sprocket that alternated between the 4 barrels in a circular motion when the trigger was pulled, in a manner not too unlike a typical clicky pen. Hilberg made 3 different models of the Liberator in both 16 and 12 gauge, and the gun he designed was very crude, with rudimentary sights and an oversized squeeze trigger similar to something like a staple gun. A later design did have a more conventional trigger and a few ergonomic improvements, but the Liberators never really took off, leaving only 4 surviving models left today, all of which were shown in the Forgotten Weapons video and are now held at the Cody Firearms Museum. Not one to give up just yet though, Hilberg would go on to make a new shotgun design for Colt called the Defender. It took a lot of design cues from the Liberator but operated in a very different way. It used an 8-cylinder revolving mechanism operated by dual triggers, one on the rear grip to fire normally and one on the front grip to be used for instinctive firing, which is just a fancy term for the point-and-shoot method of firing quickly in close quarters without relying on sights. The first version of the Defender was obviously the simplest, but the second model allowed the user to select a specific barrel to fire out of, potentially allowing the use of various load types. The third model added a non-lethal grenade launcher in the middle of the cylinder, which was fired using that front trigger, and then the final 4th model combined all of the features of the previous ones. Colt was actually pretty fond of Hilberg's design, and they pushed pretty hard for its success on the market, but aside from a small amount of use with a few civilians and police departments, the Defender crashed shortly after takeoff, with the 1970 recession keeping it from large-scale production and military service. The Defender ceased production in 1971, and since then all remaining models have either been lost or destroyed. Now, if you remember from part 1, I talked about an issue seen in early multi-shot firearms called chain fire, which is when firing one round can unintentionally set off the powder in all the other chambers. It could also potentially cause not only damage to the gun itself, but also severe injury or death to the user or any bystanders. The risk of chain fire was also a big reason why you didn't see too many revolving rifles, because while chain fire in a pistol might only injure the shooter's hand, if the cylinders are closer to the chest and face, there's a lot bigger of a threat. Another issue with revolving rifles is that the excess force blown out through the small gaps between the cylinder and barrel goes right out to the shooter's hands and arms. When shooting a regular revolver pistol, this usually isn't so much of an issue as long as you hold the gun properly, but with a revolving rifle, you're almost basically required to put your support hand in a place that almost guarantees it'll be hit by that force, as well as any excess powder or even lead splinters put out by the round transferring from the cylinder into the barrel. But despite these design flaws, several different revolving rifles did pop up over the years, some of those being the Colt First Model Patterson, the Colt 1855, the Remington 1858, and the North & Skinner Wedgelock. These all saw a limited amount of use, but due to the potential hazard they posed to the shooter as well as their relatively low firepower compared to other rifles, they didn't make much of a huge impact. And speaking of making a huge impact, what if there was a weapon that you could punch, stab, and shoot someone with all at once? Well, French inventor Louis Dornay happened to have an answer to that very question by creating a compact, collapsible, and concealable revolver simply called the Dornay Revolver, but it is perhaps better known as the Apache Revolver. The gun gets its name from the hooligans of the 19th century Parisian criminal underworld, who were often referred to as
Les Apaches.
The subculture of violent criminals was active in France from the later half of the 1800s to the early days of World War I, and modern cultural sensitivities aside,
Les Apaches
got their name from the violent savagery they were known for, which was reminiscent to people in Europe of the native Apache tribes in North America. Now, at the risk of being a bit of a Debbie Downer, there's a strong chance that the Apache Revolver wasn't actually too common of a weapon among thugs and bandits, since the gun probably had a price beyond what many street criminals could afford, and it's therefore more than likely that the name was more of a marketing gimmick for people to buy them as a self-defense weapon against the very types of people the gun was named after. Now, this compact compound weapon combines the three main tools of a typical street-level criminal: a dagger, brass knuckles, and a pistol. The firearm portion of the weapon used a simple pepperbox-style mechanism that used pinfire cartridges, which was a relatively common ammunition type in late 1800s France. Due to its rudimentary mechanism and a lack of any safety features, it was a common practice to carry the gun with one empty chamber to prevent accidental firing, and similar to other super compact palm pistols like the Turbo Palm Squeezer and the My Friend revolver, the Apache was designed to be fired at point-blank range and therefore had no sort of sights and abysmal accuracy. But these shortcomings were counteracted by the folding dagger under the cylinder and the grip that could be folded up and used as a knuckle duster. Now, you couldn't exactly stab, shoot, and punch someone all at the same time, since aside from the knuckle duster doubling as the grip, the orientation of the knuckle duster portion meant that you actually had to take your fingers completely out of the rings and turn the thing all the way around in your hand to be able to fire it. And while it might not have been the most effective at any of the three applications the gun was meant for, I'm still sure that being on the receiving end of any of them was still pretty threatening. During World War II, an experimental program designated Enfield Project DDE-3313 was created to provide British commandos with a gun based on the Apache revolver and chambered in 9mm, but for whatever reason the project fell through, and details of the project, like how many were actually made or if they were ever actually used, remains largely a mystery. Now, despite the Apache revolver's awesome, albeit very impractical design and a look evocative of a steampunk mall ninja, it hasn't actually made many appearances aside from a few top 10 lists and forum posts, with it probably being most recognizable from its very brief appearance in the recent Furiosa film, as well as the Jack the Ripper DLC from Assassin's Creed Syndicate. As you should be able to figure out by now, a lot of guns are created for the express purpose of close-quarters self-defense. With the industrial age leading to the rise of densely packed metropolitan areas and an increase in gang violence and crime, people moving to developing big cities wanted to make sure that they had a little protection on the streets, and not only just from other people. Now, apparently the risk of cyclists in the late 19th century of being attacked by stray dogs was enough of an issue for René Gallon to create a gun with the express purpose of shooting them. Shooting the stray dogs, that is, not the cyclists. To this end, Galland created the Velo Dog Revolver, whose name was a portmanteau of dog and velocipede, which is just another fancy word for a vehicle with wheels propelled by human power, the most obvious and common being the bicycle. The earliest Velo Dog pistols made by Galland fired a proprietary 5.75mm round that had slightly less power than a .22 LR, and surprisingly, some modern manufacturers actually still make this round. As the gun gained popularity, various other manufacturers began producing their own versions of the revolver to varying levels of quality and commercial success, with some being chambered for other calibers like .22 LR or .25 ACP. Some ammunition manufacturers even began making less than lethal cartridges for the revolvers, firing things like capsules of cayenne pepper, plugs of wax, or wads of wood cork. Guns referred to as Velo Dog revolvers weren't all constructed exactly the same, but almost all of them bore the same few basic characteristics. For one, they almost always had a shrouded hammer to prevent it from getting snagged while inside a pocket or a purse. This sometimes meant that the hammer was fully enclosed within the frame of the gun, but some models also had a semi-exposed hammer. Earlier Gallon models had full trigger guards, but later designs swapped that out for a folding trigger, and some were also built with a small safety lever. The guns were almost always built with smooth bore barrels, severely limiting their accuracy and range, but remember that they were meant to be fired from the seat of a bicycle at a charging stray dog, and the goal was more to scare them off rather than to actually kill them. Velo Dog revolvers operated with a double action only mechanism, with the intent being that this was the quickest and simplest firing mechanism available in revolvers at the time. For the sake of explanation, the difference in double and single action all boils down to what actually goes on when you pull the trigger. I'll demonstrate with this semi-automatic pistol, but the principle is still basically the same. So when pulling the trigger of a double action, the hammer makes two distinct moves or actions. The first being that the hammer comes back into battery, and the second being when it releases and swings back into the firing pin to set off the round and send it down range. In the case of a single action, that hammer must already be set into that backward ready position, either manually, like with a single action army, or by cycling after fire, like with a semi-automatic pistol. With guns that can fire on both double and single action, the shooter can usually choose which way they want to fire the gun. With semi-autos, you can usually use a decocker to drop back out of single action into double action, and with revolvers it's kind of the opposite, where you can actually put the hammer back manually to fire on single action. A gun that fires double action only can't have the hammer locked back in single action, meaning that every trigger pull is going to be that hard and heavy press of double action. And as is the case of the Velo Dog Revolver, this double action mechanism can also be implemented as a sort of safety. Velo revolvers were produced from the 1890s through World War I and II and all the way into the 50s, with many guns produced in the later years actually being made by individual gunsmiths in places like Spain and Belgium, who made and sold them privately. They were often made in batches, produced fast and cheap so that they could be sold quickly and at a very low price. Now, despite just being a revolver that fires a pretty underpowered round, Velo Dog revolvers were actually pretty popular. Many can still be found today in decent condition and at a reasonable price for a century-old collector's item. And while the Velo Dog revolver is certainly unique and memorable, it wasn't by any means a game changer. Revolvers in the late 1800s were everywhere, so if a new handgun was going to make an impact, it would need to do something entirely different. In 1886, Hiram Maxim introduced the world to the first fully automatic machine gun. It uses one of the earliest forms of a recoil-operated mechanism called the toggle lock, and despite it being a 138-year-old design, the gun is still used in some places of the world today. Now, the toggle lock system used by the Maxim machine gun was obviously revolutionary to firearms design, and in 1893, a man named Hugo Borchardt realized that the concept could be applied to handguns as well. And while there were certainly other auto-loading handguns that showed up before Borchardt's, nearly all of them were prototypes made for military testing and never saw any wide-scale production or use. Remember that at this time, the concept of guns even firing metal cartridges was a relatively new thing, so making pistols that fired with a self-loading mechanism was nowhere near being perfected yet. The design for these self-loading pistols in the late 1800s were all very bulky, cumbersome, overly complicated, and ultimately very impractical to use. And while the C-93 was also bulky, cumbersome, and complicated, it was slightly less so than many of its competitors, so much to the point that when German manufacturer DWM contracted Hugo's design, around 3,100 C-93 pistols were produced. The guns were shopped around to a couple different militaries, even seeing consideration by the US Army, but the gun was ultimately deemed just too different and unwieldy compared to what soldiers were using at the time. And coupled with the C-93's high cost of manufacturing, it didn't see too much commercial success, despite being a pretty competent pistol. Like I said, Hugo Borchardt designed the gun off the toggle action system of the Maxim machine gun. So when the gun is fired, the recoil flexes a two-piece arm, unlocking the breech, cycling out the spent casing, and feeding a new one in from the detachable magazine held in the grip. Due to the majority of the firing mechanism being housed in a very bulbous protrusion on the back of the gun, the distribution of weight is way off, and combined with an almost 90-degree vertical grip, this makes the gun pretty uncomfortable to shoot. The design would later be simplified and perfected by Hugo's assistant, Georg Luger, resulting in the legendary P08 pistol and the introduction of the 9mm cartridge. The C-93, however, was chambered in the proprietary 7.65x25 Borchardt round, which is dimensionally identical, yet less powerful than the 7.63 Mauser round, fired by the more successful and more well-known Mauser C-96, which was produced only a few years later. And while you could technically fire either round out of either gun, and some manufacturers even marketed their cartridges as compatible with both guns, 7.63 Mauser rounds are loaded a little bit stronger than 7.65 Borchardt and are widely considered to be a little too powerful for C-93 pistols. The C-96 was obviously a much more successful early autoloader, and although it's a very recognizable gun that isn't quite as unconventional as the C-93, its design isn't one that stuck around for too long either. It was produced by the Mauser Company all the way to the 1930s and saw several different iterations and clones from countries like China and Spain. Over 1 million C-96 pistols were produced across its different variants, making it one of the earliest widely used and commercially successful automatic pistols ever made. This was largely due to that high-velocity 7.63 Mauser round, which offered better range and stopping power than most other handguns of the era, and it was actually one of the most powerful handgun rounds available until the arrival of the .357 Magnum cartridge in the 30s. The gun is basically two giant chunks of metal slotted together with a few springs and pins inside to run the action. The gun is actually completely held together just by the friction of the parts fitting together, and only one screw on the gun is used to hold the wooden grips to the frame. Since the entire upper portion of the gun is largely just one single forged piece of metal, it's not very easy to replace worn or broken elements. Many of the older C-96 pistols that have worn down barrels from being fired so much were simply rebored to fire a new round like 9mm. Paul Mauser and the Federle brothers who designed the gun were incredibly optimistic about its ballistic performance because they built the gun with an adjustable rear sight measured out for 1,000 yards, but whether or not the gun could actually fire accuracy to that range is pretty dubious. Many C-96 pistols came with a wooden box holster that could double as a buttstock, making the gun into something like a short-barrel carbine, but Mauser also made a longer-barreled version with a full wooden forend and a more conventional buttstock as well. There was another variant constructed for the Prussian military in 1916 chambered in 9mm, but since the gun itself is nearly identical to a 7.63 Mauser, the wooden grips were engraved with a large red 9, earning them the nickname of Red 9 Pistols. Very creative. Another model called the Bolo was produced in 1920 and marketed for domestic sale with a shorter barrel and slimmer grips than earlier models, and this gun ended up being a very popular sidearm among the Bolsheviks, from where it gets its nickname. And in 1932, Mauser began producing the M712 Schnellfeuer variant, meaning fast fire, and as that would suggest, the M712 was built with a select fire capability that could fire around 900 rounds per minute, meaning that the 10-round capacity was spent in just 2/3 of a second. However, the M712 was actually built with a detachable box magazine, unlike other variants that held ammo internally and had to be loaded with a stripper clip. And Mauser also produced a 20-round magazine to allow more fire before reloading. Despite its severe recoil and muzzle climb when firing on full auto, the M712 was a big success with around 98,000 units being made during its production run. The C-96 is one of, if not the most iconic early semi-automatic pistol, and it's been used by all sorts of people like various European soldiers, future British prime ministers, Russian revolutionaries, and scruffy-looking nerf herders from a galaxy far, far away. Now, the C-96 is just one of many guns that have showed up in entertainment media as the basis for a sci-fi weapon, and in the case of the next gun on this level of the iceberg, that sci-fi look and feel requires no special effects trickery or cosmetic add-ons. Now, unfortunately, Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades doesn't actually have the F2000 in its roster, aside from the sausage gun version, because the lead developer Anton hates the gun so much that he won't even put it in the game, simply on principle. But thankfully mods exist. So the F2000 is a bullpup assault rifle produced by FN Herstal and chambered in the 5.56 round, feeding off of the same standard magazines used in rifles like FN's own Scar-L, the IWI Tavor, and of course, most AR platform rifles. The gun fires on a gas-operated short-stroke piston and rotating bolt, and while that's not too uncommon for an assault rifle, the F2000 stands out more in the way it ejects spent casings. Some of the biggest drawbacks with a bullpup-style gun are issues of case ejection, gas release, and noise of the blast, because all of those things are going on either right next to or behind the shooter's face rather than in front of it. Many bullpups are also notoriously difficult, near impossible, to shoot left-handed, and since the F2000 was intended to be fully ambidextrous, FN had to come up with something different. So instead of spent casings being shot out from the side or up from the top, the F2000 actually feeds them into a small channel above the barrel, leading them away from the action and out a chute on the front of the gun. This means that the gun will often fire several rounds before actually expelling any spent shells, sometimes spitting several out at a time, and oftentimes actually out of sequence with the actual fire rate of the gun. The design of the F2000's mechanism makes it pretty difficult to service the weapon, with most malfunctions requiring a complete field strip just to clear, and the only way to even access the chamber without taking the entire gun apart is a small hatch on the top of the gun, often referred to as the toilet seat for obvious reasons. The magazine well also has a thick rubber gasket inside, with the intent being that it would keep particles from getting caught up in the gun, but the seal is so tight that many aftermarket Stanag magazines won't actually even fit, and those that do don't always seat properly and often have to be manually yanked out since they don't drop out freely due to that rubber gasket wedging them inside. The large shroud on the top of the F2000 is sometimes misidentified as some sort of high-tech digital scope, but really all it is just a plastic shroud over a simple scope, often equated to something you'd see on a BB gun. However, this can all be removed to reveal a Picatinny rail for mounting all sorts of optics, and the gun also has basic non-adjustable iron sights. Now, all its issues aside, the F2000 is still a functional gun, and it's been adopted by various militaries, police forces, and spec ops personnel all over the world. But despite its considerable amount of use in the real world, the F2000 is probably more well known to most folks for its numerous appearances in entertainment media. Not too unlike the next gun on our list, the Calico Carbine family of rifles and pistols. If you're a big fan of 80s sci-fi or have a dad who made you watch a lot of Arnold Schwarzenegger and RoboCop movies, then you've probably seen this gun before. The Calico is produced by Calico Light Weapon Systems, and they all operate using the same roller-delayed blowback mechanism, save for a 22 variant that uses a simple straight blowback system. The guns are one of the most notable examples of helical magazines, which hold either 50 or 100 rounds in a spiral pattern and are mounted on top of the gun, with spent casings being ejected downward through a chute in front of the trigger guard. These helical magazines actually have to be wound up with a knob on the base to supply the right amount of tension so they can properly feed in the rounds. Now, looking at the profile of the gun, you might wonder where they actually put the sights, since the magazine takes up the space they'd usually be in. And Calico addressed this by simply putting the rear sight on the magazine itself, meaning that every time you reload, you are potentially throwing your sight picture off and getting a whole new zero. But you can actually attach a mount for additional optics, and newer models are also built with accessory rails in front of the magazine well for this exact purpose. But despite their very peculiar look, Calicos operate in a pretty conventional way. Their delayed blowback system is actually very similar to guns like the MP5, so aside from a pretty unique magazine arrangement, they're honestly pretty normal in their operation. Now, the guns do experience issues and malfunctions from time to time like any gun, but it's more often than not due to user error from improperly loading the magazines or tensioning the spring. One little bonus upside is that due to the way rounds are expelled out the bottom of the gun, it's actually very easy to attach a brass catcher to save shells and reload them, and at 50 to 100 rounds per magazine, that's probably not a bad idea. So back when I talked about the Walther WA 2000 in my last video, I mentioned that the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre led to the development of several different guns. And while one of the main needs for police was an effective rifle that could engage targets at long range from close quarters, they also realized that they were in need of a new handgun to replace their underpowered .32 caliber Walther PPS guns. The requirements for the sidearm were very specific, with the police wanting a gun chambered in 9mm that weighed no more than a kilogram, was no longer than 18 centimeters, was fully ambidextrous, and could be carried with a round in the chamber, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Walther and Sig Sauer both created new guns for this request, those being the P5 and P225 respectively, but both of those guns are pretty standard, and while they were both adopted into use, there was one more handgun that joined them, courtesy of the mad scientists at H&K, the P7. Now, the P7 does operate on a blowback system like most semi-automatic pistols, but it's actually a gas-operated blowback system, which is more common with rifles like the AK-47 and AR-15, and definitely not standard for handguns. The gas port is actually at the bottom of the chamber and feeds excess gases from the fired round into a small channel under the barrel to offer some of that resistant force needed on the piston to cycle the action and run the slide. And while this mechanism is a bit unusual for handguns, it actually works pretty darn well. But the gun is perhaps more well known for its very peculiar safety and charging mechanic, which is a massive switch in the grip that's earned the P7 the nickname of squeeze cocker. As that name would imply, the grip of the P7 has a sort of safety clutch that requires a force of about 15 pounds to put the firing pin into battery, after which a grip strength of only about 4 pounds is needed to continue firing. When the lever is released, the gun decocks again, making it safe to store or holster without the need of an additional safety, thus allowing the user to be instantly ready to fire again just by picking the gun up and holding it properly. The P7 is definitely a very unique handgun, and one that, despite its interesting qualities, pulls it off pretty well and has seen a lot of use with police, militaries, and private citizens all over the world. It's just one of many successful semi-automatic handguns to come out during the 20th century, but of course, not all handguns were quite as well received. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a time when revolvers ruled the world of pistols, but even then, some engineers were exploring the idea of self-loading and semi-automatic firing mechanisms for handguns, and there's perhaps none that failed more miserably than the Mauser automatic pistol. Designed by Hugh Gabbett Fairfax in the late 1890s, the Mauser pistol was intended to replace the Webley & Scott revolver used by the British military at the time. As one of the earliest examples of a semi-automatic pistol, the gun was ridiculously complex and operated in a way that was basically doomed to fail. It operated on a long recoil rotating bolt that ejected spent rounds directly backwards, right where the shooter's face is. The gun also loads rounds backwards off the magazine rather than up and forward like most handguns. Even by today's standards, the Mauser was far too mechanically complicated to be practical, and that played a big part in its rejection by basically anyone Fairfax tried to show it off to. It also didn't help that the proprietary rounds the gun fired were incredibly overpowered for a handgun, having similar ballistic performance to a rifle, and while Fairfax did experiment with a couple different calibers for the gun, none performed well enough to be a pleasant shooting experience, with his .45 Mauser long cartridge being one of the most powerful handgun rounds ever made. In the words of the captain in charge of the test trials for the Mauser pistol at the Naval Gunnery School in 1902, no one who fired once with the pistol wished to shoot it again, as firing the gun was singularly unpleasant and alarming. Despite the criticisms and suggestions on how to improve the design of the pistol, Hugh Gabbett Fairfax was far too stubborn to make any changes, leading him to cease production of the gun in 1907, with only around 80 of them ever being made. Like I said, autoloading pistols were a new concept when the Mauser came and went, and since the British military was pretty darn fond of the Webley & Scott revolvers they used, it was going to be very hard for them to switch to an entirely new mechanism of firearm, let alone just a different gun. Thankfully though, Lieutenant Colonel George Vincent Fosbery had the bright idea to meet them in the middle by designing a new automatic revolver with Webley called the Webley-Fosbery Automatic Revolver. And let me remind you that at the time, the term automatic didn't necessarily mean fully automatic. It just meant that the gun wasn't a traditional revolver and was able to load and fire rounds without the need of a bolt or a lever or some sort of manually actuated mechanism. Anyway, the earliest prototypes of Fosbery's design were actually based on the Colt single-action Army, but after refining the design some, he brought it to Webley, who adapted the build to the top-rate guns they currently had in production, and the gun entered the market in 1900. So the gun cycles automatically by sliding the entire upper half of the gun backwards when firing, using the recoil to engage a series of grooves and linkages that cock the hammer and rotate the cylinder. This ends up taking a considerable amount of weight and mechanical responsibility off of the trigger, allowing a much lighter trigger press and quicker succession of shots. Now, aside from the hand fatigue that can come with repeated fire on a long, heavy trigger press like a double-action pistol, it can be easy for the shooter to subconsciously start to over-anticipate the shot and overcompensate the weight of that heavy trigger press, mashing the trigger and throwing it slightly off target at the last moment, especially when shooting one-handed, as was common for the day. But when the action of the gun sets the hammer back already, like with a double single action or the new Fosbery, this allows for much more stable, consistent, and accurate firing because it's a much lighter trigger press. This made the Fosbery particularly popular among professional target shooters of the day, like Walter Winans, who used one in 1902 to hit 6 shots in a 2-inch group at 10 yards in 7 seconds, and 12 shots in a 3-inch group in 15 seconds. Jerry who? Both the Webley Company and Fosbery himself saw the gun as an excellent choice for cavalry troops, but for whatever reason the British military never officially adopted it. That's not to say that some soldiers didn't still use them, however, as several British officers did actually use their privately owned Fosburys as sidearms during conflicts like the Boer Wars and World War I. However, a big reason the gun didn't really take off on a wide scale was because due to its complexity, compared to a standard revolver, it was a lot more vulnerable to jams from things like dirt or mud getting caught up in the mechanism, and its bulkier build and weight made it a bit cumbersome to use compared to other Webley revolvers, especially under combat stress. Ultimately, less than 5,000 Fosbury revolvers were built, with Webley producing them until 1924 and then selling out their remaining inventory until 1939, well after Fosbury's own death in 1907. But Fosbury actually designed one last gun before his passing, that being the Paradox. If you watch my older video about the Disney Frozen Tarzan fan theory, you might remember that I briefly talked about the Paradox when trying to determine a date for the setting of Tarzan. The design that Fosbury made for the Paradox was actually pretty intuitive for the time, as the barrels were smooth like a normal shotgun up until the end, where a small amount of rifling gave the shooter a little extra bit of accuracy. This was a precursor to what would eventually develop into things like modifiable chokes seen in more modern shotguns, but the idea behind the Paradox was that it could fire both shot and slugs with much more accuracy compared to other shotguns of the day. Fosbury patented the design in 1885 and sold it for production to Holland & Holland, who produced the Paradox from 1886 to 1899. Now, H&H was considered to be one of the best manufacturers of sporting guns at the time, and even today their guns can still go for upwards of $30,000. The Paradox became a pretty popular choice among professional safari hunters, with many using them to take down things like lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, and according to soldier, explorer, and naturalist Colonel Harold George Carlos Swain, awesome name by the way, it was even suitable to take down rhinos and elephants. But for every fine piece of firearms engineering that uses innovation to become something great, there obviously has to be an example of what a terrible gun looks like for comparison. Often considered to be one of the worst shotguns ever made, the Cobray Terminator is a single-shot, open-bolt, slam-fire shotgun designed by John P. Foote and produced by the Cobray Corporation from 1987 to 1990. Now, Cobray and John Foote himself are both notorious for making guns of questionable quality, some of which we'll look at further down the iceberg, but the Terminator is perhaps their most infamous piece because of how poorly it was designed and how unpleasant it was to shoot. The gun is basically little more than two metal tubes slid over one another with a very simple trigger housing and a cheap wire stock tacked on. It fires on a reverse open bolt mechanism, meaning that rather than the bolt releasing forward on a chambered round, the round is instead flung backwards into a stationary firing pin. The entire barrel flies backwards when firing, sending a significant amount of force back at the shooter, even if the round doesn't fire, which can often happen because it's very prone to light strikes. It also doesn't help that the flat buttstock made of thin sheet metal does very little to absorb recoil and is very uncomfortable to shoulder, making the Terminator an unpleasant gun to shoot as well as an impractical one. The inner workings of the gun are ridiculously simple, with the trigger itself doing little more than simply holding the barrel from flinging backwards, and a bolt lever fixed to the left side of the barrel is used to open the breech and load shells, which also have to be manually inserted and extracted since the gun has no sort of ejection mechanism on it. The Terminator has been almost universally described as extremely uncomfortable to shoot, with many wondering why the gun was even made at all since its terrible design and single-shot capability has no practical application that would be served by something better. And it's not like the retail price was a big trade-off or anything, since the cost of around $120 could still buy you several different low-end guns that perform way better. The Cobray Terminator is just one of many failed ideas for a cheap and simple gun, and that market certainly isn't going away anytime soon. But with a big rise in the demand for personal defense and concealed carry weapons among private citizens in the last few years, the competition between different manufacturers has been stiff, and some have tried to gain an edge by adding superfluous features and dumb gimmicks to their guns in a bid to trick people into thinking they're a good option. Like the Cellphone gun made by Ideal Conceal. Hello? Oh, hold on just a second. I'm about to get mugged. That guy's got an MRS red dot on his AR. Shoot him! Now, this was a short-lived concealment gun that could fold up to resemble a smartphone. It was chambered in both .380 and 9mm and retailed for about $500. It also came with a belt clip mount if you wanted to rock that middle-aged white dad look, but since the grip folded up into the trigger guard, you could also just carry it in your pocket. The gun is essentially just a two-shot break barrel Derringer, and it works fine, but it was released in 2018 at a time where there were plenty of other super compact concealment pistols that carried way more ammunition while still being just about the same size or smaller and costing just about as much, if not a little bit cheaper. Now, the gun's resemblance to a cell phone actually ended up being its undoing, since it garnered a lot of controversy from anti-gun politicians who argued that not only would a two-shot Derringer lead to a massive spike in crime and mass shootings, but it would also give police more opportunities to target people by not knowing whether they actually had a cell phone or a gun, and it could also pose a danger to children who didn't know the difference between an iPhone and a gun. Chuck Schumer even said that anyone who bought such a dangerous weapon clearly wanted it for evil intent.
It looks like a typical iPhone in its case, just like this. Take a closer look and you will see it's a real, live, deadly handgun. It's clearly being marketed for nefarious purposes. 4,000 people have already signed up online. They want it as soon as it becomes available. 4,000 people are ready to pull the trigger on this dangerous purchase. I am urging the ATF and the Department of Justice to step in, investigate these handguns before they hit the store shelves. Following massacre after massacre and countless gun-related tragedies across the country, we should be doing everything we can to end rash gun violence.
Due to the massive amount of negative media outcry against the ideal Conceal, it would be investigated by the ATF, who, in an extremely rare W, decided that the gun was in no way a violation of the legal definition of a handgun and required no special regulation. With its reputation already tarnished, the cell phone gun would end up being a victim of the COVID-era supply chain shortages, and its production was discontinued in 2022. And before any of you lambaste me in the comments about owning a gun like this, calm down. It's a toy I paid $7 for. Now, weird concealment guns that fold up to look like something else are obviously nothing new, and even back in World War II, German officers had their own secret gun that let them fight below the belt on any would-be assassins or attackers. Or rather, fight on the belt. While being held captive in a prisoner camp during World War I, an engineer named Louis Marquis came up with an idea for a concealable gun that would be worn on a person's body in a way that even if taken captive, they would probably still have a good chance of keeping it, allowing them to fight back or escape. When the war ended and he returned home in 1915, he began to work on his design and eventually created the Koppelschloss Pistola, a 4-barrel gun concealed within a belt buckle. He was commissioned in 1943 by Heinrich Himmler himself to build several of these guns for high command, and Marquis ended up making at least 5 of them according to his widow, but he may have made as many as 12. That is, of course, assuming that story is even true, since there's actually very little hard evidence that Nazi officers actually had guns hidden in their belt buckles. Now, there was definitely a guy named Louis Marquis who designed a belt buckle gun, but there is very little evidence to suggest that it's the same design, or that he was ever even contracted by the SS to make them. This has led some to believe that the belt buckle guns are actually fakes created post-war for collectors who wanted unique Nazi artifacts, and the story behind them was just made up off of half-truths. But it's still a pretty cool idea, so let's talk about how it works. So the gun deploys by pressing 2 switches on the top and bottom of the buckle, releasing the inner mechanism and swinging it outward, revealing 4 trigger switches connected to 4 smoothbore barrels that can fire off one by one or all together. A switch on the base of the barrels can then be pressed to fold the gun back down, recocking the 4 switches and allowing the gun to be reloaded again. Honestly, it's a pretty neat design, and it's kind of surprising that the belt buckle gun hasn't really showed up much in movies or games aside from the Black Lagoon spin-off Roberta's Blood Trail, where the titular character uses it to assassinate an enemy soldier. Honestly, I'd love to see more of the belt buckle gun, and I think it would fit right into plenty of World War II adjacent stories like something in the Indiana Jones or Wolfenstein universe. Now, speaking of guns making an appearance in movies, let's talk about the SerLea submachine gun. It was allegedly designed by a Lebanese war veteran who made the weapon for use in close-quarters street warfare. He brought the gun to the US with the help of a company called Armscraft and Engineering, or ACE, and showed it off to the LAPD, who did take a mild interest in the gun, but ultimately decided that they needed to go a different direction. But I still wonder what they would have used it for, since the gun actually has no sights and was designed to fire from the hip with no precision. It's basically just two individual machine guns mounted side by side and connected to a single trigger and charged by a single cocking lever at the back of the gun. Each side has its own individual barrel, bolt, and magazine, but a synchronizing mechanism makes both portions fire in unison. You can still fire one side at a time by only loading one magazine at a time, but where would the fun in that be? It's believed that only one demonstration model of the SerLea was ever actually made, and after its rejection by the LAPD, it would be used in 1994 as a prop gun in the action B-movie Direct Hit, where it makes a blink-and-you'll-miss-it appearance in the final shootout. After that, it was presumably sold to a private collector around 1997. Obviously, the SerLea is just one of many guns more well known for their media appearances than for their real-world use, and I'd wager that many of us who are big gun nuts first got into the world of firearms thanks to the games we play and the movies or shows we watch. And if you couldn't tell by the Lego sets on the bookshelf behind me, or from the hour-long video I made before starting this Iceberg series, or just from my YouTube username, I really like Star Wars, or at least what it used to be. I miss
the idea of it.
And for those of you that didn't know, almost every single blaster in the Star Wars universe is a real gun with a few cosmetic modifications, the most obvious being Han Solo's DL-44 heavy blaster that is built off a C-96. George Lucas and his creative team intentionally decided to use real-world firearms as props in the films, not only just to save time and money on prop design, but also because many guns from the late 1800s and early 1900s can easily pass off as a sci-fi retrofuturistic weapon with very little modifications or cosmetic dress-ups. This is a style that's carried on through the Star Wars universe to this day, and I might actually end up doing a video looking at all the real-world guns seen throughout the Star Wars universe, but the one I want to talk about today is perhaps the second most recognizable blaster pistol from the Star Wars mythos, the Blastech IB-94, or as we call it in the real world, the Bergmann 1894. The development of the gun was a joint effort between German engineer Louis Schmeisser and Theodor Bergmann, who owned the manufacturing company Bergmann Industrial Works. While better known at the time for making bicycles and early automobile technology, Bergmann was actually very interested in weapons manufacturing, and his company produced a new pistol every year between the years 1893 and 1910. Now, that first 1893 model was nothing more than a prototype and was never sold commercially, but its design was tweaked and later released the next year as the model 1894. The biggest difference was that rather than a delayed blowback mechanism used by the earlier model, the 1894 used direct blowback. The difference in these two firing mechanisms is pretty minor but still significant, so I'll briefly explain it here. When firing an automatic or semi-automatic gun, the bolt or slide has to stay closed long enough for the ignition of the gunpowder to build enough gas pressure to safely and properly fire the round before the spent shell is ejected out of the breech. In the case of a direct blowback, that delay happens based on the weight of the bolt or slide combined with the friction of the moving parts and usually the compression force of some sort of spring. It's all based around the balance of weight and velocity and a whole lot of physics and math, but that's essentially the basics of it. The problem with this design is that the bigger and more powerful round you have, the stronger and heavier you need to make the bolt or slide or spring, meaning that eventually you reach a point when it becomes impractical or nearly impossible to have a gun that still works this way. To take this concept to a ridiculous level, if you had a 20mm cannon that fired on direct blowback, it would need a bolt that weighed at least 500 pounds to even possibly be able to cycle rounds. This is why direct blowback is almost exclusively seen with small caliber guns like rimfire or pistol rounds. With a delayed blowback system, there is some type of mechanical element that plays a part in holding back the bolt. The most common examples are roller delay and gas delay, but there are a couple different types of delayed blowback that still use the same basic idea. And while more mechanically complex than simple blowback, delayed blowback allows for the use of more powerful rounds without needing a large and heavy bolt or slide. There's obviously a lot more to it, but if you're interested in finding out more about the ins and outs of gunsmithing and engineering, then you should visit the sponsor of today's video, the Sonoran Desert Institute. Alright, let me just be clear, that was a joke. I'm not actually sponsored by SDI, although I wish I was, but the joke was right there. I had to, okay? Like I said, the earlier Bergmann prototypes actually used a delayed blowback method, and the design was simplified into the direct blowback mechanism seen in the 1894 model. It was marketed as the Bergmann No. 1, becoming the first commercially available firearm ever produced by Bergmann. It was provided in several different calibers and shown off to various militaries as a contender to other early repeaters like the aforementioned C-93, but it didn't really take off. The design was further modified and re-released in 1896, this time with new features like a side door that swung open to allow the shooter to load new rounds, and a mechanical extractor that better ejected spent shells. Several thousand model 1896 pistols were made, and although they didn't really see much military use, they still saw a pretty moderate amount of success in the civilian market. The next year, the design was again modified, this time swapping the internal magazine with a detachable box magazine and chambering the gun for a larger and more powerful 7.8 Bergmann cartridge. A carbine version was also built with a longer barrel and detachable buttstock, but the model 1897 still saw very little commercial success, largely because it was essentially a lesser version of the Mauser C-96 which had come out the previous year and had been dominating both the military and civilian markets at the time. The Bergmann pistol would be revamped and re-released several times over the next few years, with the design changing slightly every time and different models being geared towards different markets. For example, the Bergmann Simplex was a small-frame direct blowback variant marketed as a civilian pocket pistol, while the Bergmann Mars was a much larger and sturdier version made for military contracts and chambered in 9mm Largo. This Mars model was adopted by the Spanish military, who ordered 3,000 of them in 1905, but due to production issues and some corporate drama, the Bergmann Company spent 2 years trying to find a new subcontractor to help them with manufacturing, during which the Spanish military made a couple different suggestions and requests on the gun, leading to the updated 1908 model. A special variant was also chambered in .45 ACP and submitted to the US military, but it was rejected. However, the gun caught on with the Danish military, who had a few design ideas of their own, and in 1910, the Bergmann Bayard pistol was released as the final version of the original Bergmann automatic pistol. The same year, Theodore Bergmann would decide to focus mainly on manufacturing guns and sold the automobile portion of his company to a guy named Carl Benz of Mercedes-Benz. Bergmann and Schmeisser would then go on to produce one of the first submachine guns to be mass-produced for military service, the MP-18. The gun saw limited service during the final months of World War I, but by the time the Treaty of Versailles went into effect, banning German manufacturers from making military weapons, Bergmann had produced around 35,000 of them before selling the license off to SIG Arms, who rebranded the gun and started remanufacturing it as the SIG MP-20. And while by today's standards still a pretty clunky and unbalanced gun, the MP-18 still holds the reputation as one of the best early machine guns. But the same can't be said for the next gun on the list, the machine rifle model 1915 CSRG light machine gun, better known as the Chauchat. Much of the combat in World War I centered around trench warfare, which was when opposing sides would set up static fortifications where they could blast back and forth at each other with small arms and artillery. And if one side wanted to overtake the other, the two main options were to either blast enough ordnance at them until everyone was dead, or to charge across the space between the two trench networks, often referred to as no man's land. This sort of advancement was extremely risky, since anyone who came out of the cover of the trenches and charged across the open space between them was making themselves a pretty big target for the enemy. To combat this, many militaries began to implement a tactic called walking fire, which was when a soldier or group of soldiers fired rapidly from the hip in the general direction of the enemy without aiming, laying down a blanket of suppressive fire and giving them a better chance to actually advance. Since many early machine guns of the day were too large and complicated to be carried around and fired at the same time, many gun manufacturers began creating a new class of gun that combined the rapid fire capability of a machine gun with the portability of a rifle, leading to guns like the BAR, which is widely considered to be one of the best and most influential early machine guns, as well as the Chauchat, which is widely considered to be one of the worst machine guns of World War I, and possibly one of the worst guns ever made. But that negative reputation is actually up for a little bit of debate, so let me explain. The Chauchat was used by the French military as a cheap weapon that could be manufactured quickly and sent to the front lines by the thousands. And because of that cheap construction, it had some very peculiar design features that could cause a whole host of problems. For one, the reciprocating barrel was encased in an aluminum radiator meant to vent off heat, but after enough sustained fire, the aluminum would actually begin to heat up too much, causing it to expand, eventually wedging itself into the barrel shroud and rendering the gun inoperable. The gun also fired off of half-circle shaped magazines made of very thin steel with two massive slots in them that were intended to aid with loading the magazine and being able to see how many rounds had been fired, but it also almost guaranteed that any kind of mud, dirt, and debris would make its way in, causing feeding issues and possibly even passing further up into the gun, causing further malfunctions. Some of the Chaushat's other shortcomings were a long and heavy trigger pull, a clunky recoil, a very awkward sight picture, and a pretty low rate of fire for a machine gun, but despite all of its issues, there wasn't really anything else like it at the time, so its flaws were overlooked for its advantages. Over 200,000 Chauchats were made during its production run, and it saw extensive use throughout World War I and afterwards in the hands of over 20 different militaries, including France, Belgium, the US, and it even saw limited use in World War II by German occupying forces in France. Now, despite the Chaushat's infamy, that negative reputation is actually up for some debate. It's by no means a great gun, but if properly operated and cared for, it works. Not exactly well, but it works. The reason the Chaushat has a cloud over its name these days is largely because of one specific variant made for the US military that was chambered in .30-06. Because of its rushed development, a lot of measurements were off, adjustments were badly calculated, and conversions from metric to imperial weren't always converted correctly, leading to very poorly built guns that had a whole lot of mechanical issues that could easily cause the gun to jam or just straight up break the gun. On top of that, there's not much of a record that Americans were ever provided with a manual or service guide for the gun, meaning that they not only had to figure out how to use the gun on their own, but they also had to teach themselves how to service them too. The Chaushat's name was further tarnished by other guns that came after it, proving to be much better weapons, but the gun's presence on the collector market also had a very big impact on its reputation. When decommissioned Chauchats were sent to the US to be sold to collectors, they had to be rendered inoperable, usually by destroying parts of the mechanism or welding certain moving parts in place. In order for them to be able to fire again, all of that had to be reversed, and it wasn't always done professionally by gunsmiths who really knew what they were doing. And that's not really exclusive to just the Chaushat, because any deactivated gun or parts kit that is badly reassembled will most likely perform badly. But in order to make sure that you're not one of those gunsmiths who builds guns badly, be sure to check out the sponsor of today's video, the Sonoran Desert. World War I was the linchpin for the development of many different firearm concepts that are still used in guns being made today, and there's still guns from World War I that are actually being used by dozens of militaries to this very day. It just goes to show that just because a gun is outdated, it doesn't mean that you have to stop using it. Just ask the samurai. Some of the best surviving examples of early firearms are Japanese matchlock Tanegashimas. These were used by various samurai groups and came in all different sizes and served a variety of purposes. They came in pistol form, some had multiple barrels or longer barrels or larger bore barrels to fire larger shots. They used them on foot, on horseback, mounted on ships or castle walls, and there was even a special class of Tanegashima made specifically for use by samurai leaders called the Samurai Zutsu, which had longer barrels, fired larger rounds, and were made with much better quality and care than the weapons used by the peasant-class foot soldiers that samurai commanded. Japanese Tanegashimas were also some of the earliest firearms to fire by pressing an actual trigger rather than gripping down on an entire lever, making their mechanisms a little bit more sophisticated. And samurai loved their guns, so much to the point that by the mid-1500s, there were over 300,000 guns in Japan. And while other parts of the world started to adopt wheel locks and flintlocks, the Japanese still loved the matchlock Tanegashimas so much that they held onto them well into the 1800s. But despite that, the use of firearms in Japan didn't really stick around as well as you might think. As time went on and Japan saw fewer conflicts, the arrival of the Edo period led to guns being used less often, and eventually Tanegashimas were really only used for hunting or target practice. With the arrival of the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, Japan started to transfer their arsenal and military structure to match the modern weapons and tactics of other countries, but some samurai did still try to stick to the old way of things. The last recorded use of traditional samurai warfare in Japan was during the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, where the newly assembled Japanese Imperial Army put down a resistance of samurai armed with Tanegashimas who who refused to adapt to modernization. A few decades later, in the lead up to World War I, Japan again realized that they had a lot of catching up to do with their weapons capability, and this led Lieutenant Kijiro Nambu to begin working on a new sidearm for Japanese soldiers. Now, Nambu got his start in gunsmithing as an apprentice to Nariakira Arasaka, who made a name for himself as a prolific firearms designer and manufacturer, just like you can do with the help of today's sponsor, the Sonoran Desert Okay, I promise that's the last time I'll do that. But really, SDI, call me. When Kijiro was promoted to major, he was tasked with designing a new pistol and completed the first version in 1902. It loosely resembled the German P08 Luger, but the Nambu operated in a direct blowback method rather than the toggle lock of the Luger. This Type A 1902 model didn't really see use by the Japanese military yet, but several thousand were still sold to China and Siam. Kijiro made an updated Type B model in the 1920s, and then later the Type 14 in 1926, and this one would be adopted as the official new sidearm for officers, although the officers still had to pay for the guns themselves, and many still preferred to use other pistols instead. This was because the Nambu pistol wasn't really that good of a weapon. For one, the 8x22mm rounded shot was rather underpowered at nearly half the energy of a 9mm. It also didn't help that the Nambu's weak striker and fragile firing pin made the gun very prone to light strikes, causing some rounds not to fire at all, and sometimes even causing the firing pin itself to just snap. The gun also had a number of ergonomic issues as well, like an awkwardly placed safety lever and various other flaws that made reloading an unpleasant process. The earlier models had an honestly badly designed safety catch that didn't let an empty magazine fall freely out of the gun, meaning that you had to yank the magazine out while fighting against the strength of the recoil and leaf springs. The Type 14 pistol did fix this issue, but it didn't really help make reloading any better because the magazines themselves often had weak springs and caused loaded rounds to wedge against the walls of the magazine, causing feeding issues, friction loss, and further weakening the spring. You also had to be very selective with the ammo you used, since certain types of ammo like soft points or lead tips could cause chambering issues. Ultimately, the Nambu pistol wasn't really an effective weapon and served more as a status symbol and belt accessory. But since it was kind of the only option, several 100,000 of them were produced and distributed all throughout Japan. And in 1936, the Type 14 was updated again, this time having a larger trigger guard to allow the gun to be easier fired while wearing gloves. There was also an experimental version of the Nambu pistol that had a sword blade mounted to the frame of the gun, with a Type B version being permanently fixed and the Type 14 version having a detachable blade, but neither of these ever saw wide-scale use or production and were little more than just a proof of concept. As Japan moved closer towards the conflict of World War II, they realized that people in tanks and air crews needed a lighter and more compact sidearm than the Type 14. So Kijiro Nambu went back to the drawing board again and came up with the Type 94 in 1930. It was very different than the Type 14's design, this time firing with a hammer rather than a weak striker like the Type 14, and basically had a sturdier and more reliable build all around, but it still had quite a few flaws. For one, the slide would lock open on an empty magazine, but this was kind of pointless since the magazine was all that actually held the slide back, meaning that as soon as you took it out, the slide would slam closed and had to be racked again when loading a fresh magazine anyway. The gun was also built with an external sear bar, which can either be intentionally or accidentally pressed, causing the gun to fire around without even pulling the trigger. And while that's certainly dangerous, it wasn't actually overlooked, since accidental discharges can be easily avoided the same way they can with any gun, by engaging the safety. Now, there's actually a huge misconception that the Type 94 was intentionally designed to fire around using that exposed sear without pulling the trigger as a sort of surprise attack in a false surrender situation, but that's just not true. The gun was designed and built in the 30s, at a time when Japan wasn't really threatened or in fear of having to surrender to anyone, and sure, the flaw in the gun may have been exploited in some specific cases, but it almost definitely wasn't a feature that was consciously engineered into the gun. Remember, these guns had to be made fast, cheap, and simple for the Japanese military, so slapping the sear bar to the outside of the frame with a simple flip-up safety switch to block it from moving really fit those requirements. And really, that just goes to prove that a gun is only as dangerous as you let it be, and that true firearm safety depends more on you, not the gun in your hand. Now, safety concerns aside, both the Type 14 and Type 94 are by no means great guns that are simply misunderstood. There are definitely misconceptions about them, but Nambus still are not well designed or well constructed, and they started to see an even bigger noticeable dip in build quality as the war came to a close. These later pistols are sometimes referred to as last-ditch guns, since they were produced with low-quality materials on rush orders with very little quality control. And since a lot of these later guns were confiscated by US forces or taken as souvenirs and collector's pieces, that's a big reason why Nambus tend to have a bad reputation. But that's not to say that nothing good came from them, since the design of the Nambu Type 14 inspired William Ruger to make the Ruger Standard, which was the first gun ever produced by the Ruger Company, and is widely considered to be one of the best rimfire pistols ever made. Now, the reason that so many turn-of-the-century autoloading pistols used such unique and unconventional designs is because the principle of semi-automatic fire was still a new concept in the early 1900s, so everyone was still trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. Because of this, there were quite a few of these early pistols that were very overly complicated. Case in point, the Frommer Stop made in 1912. Designed by Hungarian gunsmith Rudolf Frommer, the gun saw several iterations before its final design that became known as the Stop. The gun is known for its long recoil mechanism, meaning that the breech stays locked when the round is fired and only opens once the bolt has come fully backward. The bolt and barrel are also locked together for a majority of the action, meaning that all the weight moving back and forth causes a pretty bitey recoil. Like I said, it's a pretty mechanically complex design, but the Austro-Hungarian military liked it enough to use the Stop as their standard sidearm in World War I, and the gun still saw a decent amount of use all the way to World War II, with over 360,000 of the pistols being produced from 1912 to 1945. The Stop's mechanism also made it very easy to convert the gun to full auto, but machine pistol versions of the Stop were actually pretty rare. However, an experimental gun was designed to imitate the Italian Villar Perosa M1915 by turning two Frommer Stops upside down, mounting them side by side in a frame, and attaching spade grips and a bipod, making it into a sort of pistol caliber light machine gun. Very few of these guns were made, and they were quickly replaced in 1917 by a direct copy of the Villar Perosa called the Sturmpistola. While a lot of early guns in the 1900s didn't end up sticking around, others cemented themselves as practical and capable designs that are still used today. One such mechanism was the inertia recoil operation, which was first effectively implemented in the Sjogren shotgun or Sjogren shotgun. Shotguns were by no means a new idea when Carl Axel Theodor Sjogren began working on his own in 1900, but a reliable and effective semi-automatic shotgun was basically unheard of aside from a few outliers like the Browning Auto 5. But the Browning used the long recoil firing mechanism, which was still a newer concept at the time, but had already proven to be effective. However, the inertia system of the Sjogren, while similar, still has a few different things going on. Rather than relying on recoil to move the bolt and barrel to run the action, the inertia system uses the mass of the bolt itself, using a bolt body that is a separate piece from the bolt head, acting as that inertial mass. The barrel itself is actually fixed in place to the frame of the gun and doesn't move at all when firing. When the gun fires, the recoil pushes backwards into the shooter, with the bolt body being kept in place by inertia. This compresses a spring on the back and then pushes the inertial mass of the bolt, sending it rearward, which ejects the spent shell and cycles the action. A return spring then stops the bolt and returns it forward, loading a new round and locking the bolt in place for the next shot. This system is incredibly efficient and robust, and while the size of the inertial mass needs to be pretty big to cycle the action properly, this really isn't a problem with shotguns due to the power of a shotgun shell requiring pretty bulky parts anyway. The inertia system also has the advantage of working with almost any load type, unlike other semi-automatic systems and shotguns, since anything from low power loads to magnums can still cycle the action as long as it provides just enough force to compress the initial spring. The Sjogren is also one of the earliest examples of takedown guns, as it can be quickly and easily taken apart for transport or storage by simply pulling a knob and twisting the barrel off the frame. Around 5,000 Sjogren shotguns were built during the few years that it was in production, and an experimental rifle version was also created to fire 7.62x63, or as it's correctly called, 30-06. The Sjogren rifle was trialed by a few different militaries, but wasn't adopted by any, so it never saw wide-scale production. Now, oddly enough, the inertia system basically died off when the Sjogren ran out of production, and it didn't really come back until the 1980s, when Benelli redeveloped the Inertia system for their M series of shotguns. Browning themselves would also redesign the mechanism of the Auto 5 in 2014, which, remember, was a direct competitor to the Sjogren. This new gun by Browning operated on a modified Inertia system and was reintroduced as an entirely new gun, the A5 Kinematic. Now, a big reason that we don't really see the Inertia system used in shotguns on a wide scale is because in order for the mechanism to properly work, there has to be a very specific balance of weight and mass between the frame of the gun and the bolt. This means that certain accessories or extra ammunition storage added to the gun would add extra weight and mass that can throw off the gun's ability to cycle, such as if you were to add, say, a 16-round revolving magazine like the SRM 1216. If you've been a gamer since the early 2010s, you probably recognize this gun from its appearance in games like Black Ops 2, Deus Ex, and the severely underrated and forgotten Brink. Similar to the Calico Carbine, the internals of the gun are actually pretty standard, using a delayed blowback system like many modern semi-automatic shotguns, but most of the gun's uniqueness comes from the design of the magazine. It's made up of 4 individual tubes that hold 4 rounds each and mounts under the barrel similar to the PP-19 Bison. The magazine latches into a rotating mount that can be manually turned either way to swap between the 4 loading tubes, allowing the shooter to rapidly fire off all 16 rounds or swap between different ammunition types by loading each tube with a different type of shells. SRM has made over 25,000 of their shotguns since production began in the late 2000s, and the gun has actually seen use with both civilians and law enforcement in the years since. The M1216 was actually named Shotgun of the Year in 2013 by the NRA, and SRM has made a couple different variations of the shotgun, including an 8-round short barrel version and a less lethal only variant called the Ringfire. Obviously, shotguns are popular for their versatility and ease of use compared to other types of firearms. And while no gun should ever be used irresponsibly, it doesn't really take an incredible amount of experience or accuracy to use one effectively. And in more recent years, shotguns have seen a lot of application as close-quarters personal defense weapons. The KSG I talked about on the first level of the iceberg is probably one of the first examples that many of you think about, but there's actually several other shotguns with a pretty similar design. Take the Turkish UTS-15 for example. Now, like the KSG, it's a pump-action shotgun that feeds off of dual magazine tubes, but it has several design features that make it very different. First and most obvious is that the tubes are actually built above the barrel and are loaded from individual loading gates on either side of the gun, rather than underneath and behind like a KSG. It's a little bit bigger and bulkier than the KSG as well, and is by many accounts kind of crudely constructed. It has a trapdoor style panel to access the breech, similar to the F-2000's toilet seat, and it has vented magazine tubes which are meant to allow the shooter to see how much ammo they have, but it can also let in all sorts of dirt and debris that can get inside the gun. The gun can feed ammo off of either tube individually, just like the KSG, but it can also be set to alternate loading between both tubes at once, but this has been pretty prone to feeding issues. The UTS-15 has seen 4 different generations over the years that have tweaked or upgraded the design, improving things like the pump mechanism, fixing some loading issues, and replacing a lot of the plastic parts with stronger materials, but it still hasn't really been able to make much of a name for itself as an actually good shotgun. But at least it's still debatably better than the next shotgun on the list, the HS-10. This is a bullpup semi-automatic shotgun designed in the 1950s, which was a time when neither bullpup shotguns nor semi-automatic shotguns were too incredibly common. The idea came from a Santa Monica police sergeant named Alfred Crouch, who wanted a weapon to be what he called the ultimate entry shotgun for LA SWAT teams. Crouch originally designed his idea around a semi-automatic Remington shotgun, but later sold the design to High Standard Manufacturing in the 60s, who modified the design to be built off of their own C-1200 Supermatic shotgun. The design essentially just gets rid of the traditional grip and buttstock and moves the trigger forward to a pistol grip under the magazine tube that's connected to the firing mechanism with a metal rod. A plastic shell is built over the main part of the gun with a swiveling shoulder pad connected to the back, and some models have also had an internal flashlight built on top. And in concept, all of these features could actually be pretty useful to police officers who might need to use the gun in tight or dark areas, but the HS-10 is actually pretty problematic in reality. The big advantage to a semi-automatic shotgun is that you can pop off a lot more rounds faster than if you were using a pump action or bolt action, but that is of course assuming that the gun actually manages to feed rounds properly, which the HS-10 doesn't always do. It's known to be picky with the type of shells it can at least possibly feed reliably, with high standards saying that only magnum loads and high brass shells are acceptable, but even those don't always feed and cycle properly. The models that have the built-in flashlight also tend to fail due to the gun's own recoil shaking the battery housing loose and breaking it. The shoulder plate that takes the place of a traditional buttstock also spins freely, which I assume is meant to make shooting around corners in tight spaces easier, but this and the gun's clunky trigger are actually the two chief complaints of the HS-10. Another huge flaw is that the HS-10 was completely unusable by a left-handed shooter. Unlike how you can dual-wield the HS-10 in the original Black Ops, shooting one from the left side is actually explicitly prohibited to the point that the gun itself actually tells you not to. The reason for this is that the ejection port would be right by your face when shouldering it on the left side, and that's where the shells are being spat out, right at your face. Now, the HS-10 didn't actually show any of these shortcomings until being shopped around to various police forces that did use them for a time, but ultimately they all decided that the HS-10 just wasn't worth the trouble. See, the appeal to a shotgun for combat and tactical purposes is that it has to be versatile and practical. And in the past, many police officers and soldiers would actually have to carry an entirely separate shotgun just for things like breaching doors. And if you're going to swap out a rifle for a shotgun, it better be worth it. Unless, of course, you can just attach the shotgun right to your rifle. In the 1980s, Knight's Armament developed the Masterkey system, which was a cut-down Remington 870 that could be mounted to a Picatinny rail very similar to an M203 grenade launcher. It was called the Masterkey because it can open any lock by blasting it to smithereens. The Masterkey has seen a lot of success and is actually still in use to this day, but one of the biggest flaws with the pump action is that swapping between ammo types can be a bit tedious, and running the pump action mechanism while also trying to hold onto the rifle it's mounted to can be a bit difficult, and it also doesn't help that the magazine of the rifle acts as a very poor pistol grip for the shotgun. All of these shortcomings were addressed with a different underbarrel shotgun called the M26 Modular Accessory Shotgun System designed by Seymour Systems. Now, rather than a tube-fed pump action like the Masterkey, the MAS is a straight pull bolt action fed by a detachable magazine, giving it the advantage of having better ergonomics, as well as allowing the user to swap load types by just swapping to a different magazine. The M26 can also be detached and mounted in a standalone buttstock housing, allowing it to be used like a more standard shotgun, with the rear mounting ring actually serving as the rear sight. The US military has slowly been phasing out the Masterkey for the M26 over the last few years, with early trials going back as far as 2003 and the first official field tests in 2011. Now, it's important to remember that the M26 was not designed as a combat shotgun or a primary weapon. It was made almost exclusively to serve as a breaching tool. Small support shotguns certainly do have their place, but the MAS isn't going to be replacing a classic Mossberg 500 anytime soon. That's because while they might not work the best when clamped onto the underside of an M4, pump actions are one of the most popular, versatile, and reliable types of shotguns out there, and for a lot of people, they're kind of the only gun or first gun they ever shoot. Now, if you've ever looked at a shotgun shell, you'd know that they can be pretty darn thick. Where's my shotgun shell? Here we go. If you've ever looked at a shotgun shell, you'd know that they can be pretty darn thick. Compared to a 5.56 round, they take up a lot more space, and the issue of ammo capacity has always been a hot topic in shotgun design. But what if the shotgun shell was just a little bit shorter? Well, it wouldn't make much of a difference because the Techno Arms Mag 7 does exactly that and still doesn't provide a much more compact or high-capacity gun. Often described as looking like an incredibly beefy Uzi, the Mag 7 only holds 5 rounds in a magazine that loads in the grip like a typical handgun. This makes the grip extremely thick and difficult to get a good hold on because even though the proprietary 6mm shells it fires are a bit shorter than a standard 12 gauge, they're still just as thick. And because the gun is more or less a scaled-up pistol, a lot of the controls feel pretty spaced apart, with many awkwardly placed buttons and switches kind of being all over the gun. And coupled with its proprietary ammunition, the gun is not really considered to be all that appealing to shoot, and it's not really seen much popularity. It also has a blazingly terrible design choice in that the forend slides over the trigger guard when being pumped, meaning that the shooter can't actually rest their shooting finger out of the trigger guard and therefore kind of has to keep their shooting finger on the trigger even when not ready to fire, which is a huge no-no. Despite Techno Arms still producing the Mag 7 today, the gun has not seen a whole lot of popularity with police, and the civilian model hasn't really fared much better since they're built with a big wooden buttstock and an elongated barrel to meet NRA requirements, which completely defeats the purpose of the gun being a compact weapon for close quarters combat. Now, Techno Arms did build a dual-purpose variant of the gun with a less lethal launcher mounted on the top, but it too has also seen very limited success. Now, the biggest reason for the Mag 7's lack of success, aside from its ergonomics, is because of that proprietary 60mm shell it fires. Now, it's shorter than a standard 2 3/4 shell, meaning that the magazine can't fit most common loads, but it's also longer than many shells like the ones made by Aguila, which will fit in the magazine, but don't feed reliably, meaning that your best option is to shell out the money for the specialty ammo from the few manufacturers that make it. Now, I've already talked about a couple different guns on this iceberg that use their own proprietary ammunition, and as several of them have shown, that often ends up being a really big reason why they don't see a lot of use. Oftentimes, the cost just isn't worth the rarity, and in the case of your typical 12-gauge shell, why try to fix what isn't broken? Unless, of course, you're Russian. Yeah, 12-gauge is cool and all, but 12 is 8-gauge too many. The KS-32 is currently the largest bore shotgun in use today, with a barrel diameter of around 1 inch. This is a 12-gauge, and this is what a KS-32 shoots. Now, by Russian standards, the KS-32 is technically a carbine since it has a rifled barrel, and the KS in the name actually stands for Karabin Specjalny, or Specialty Carbine. It was originally designed in the 70s and based on the Winchester 1200 as a weapon to help guards suppress prison riots, and the barrels were actually built off of ones made for the GSH-23 autocannon. The Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs has been using the KS-23 since the 80s for all sorts of crowd control, and there are actually 5 different load types made for it. There's your typical buckshot rounds, and then a barricade round that fires a solid steel slug with enough power to destroy a car's engine block at 100 yards. Then there's less lethal loads that fire rubber or plastic shells, as well as shells that launch miniature tear gas grenades and flashbangs, and there's also blank rounds for training and firing larger grenades off of a barrel device. And honestly, you can't really blame the Russians for wanting to be multi-purpose, because if you want to suppress the masses into thinking that communism is a good idea, you'll need a lot of tools in your belt. And as fun as it might be, not every problem can be solved by blasting buckshot at it. Sometimes you need to be a little quieter. When I covered level 1 of the Weird Gun Iceberg in my last video, I talked about the Welrod pistol, which is considered to be one of the quietest guns ever made, with an average sound level quieter than a typical pellet gun. But you might be surprised to learn that the next gun on level 2 is actually even quieter. The OTS-38 Stechkin is able to maintain a sound level of basically nothing thanks to the very unique design of the 7.62x41 SP4 round it fires. Now, a typical modern handgun round is made up of a few basic components: the casing, the primer, the powder, and of course, the projectile. The SP4 rounds have a few extra parts, namely an internal piston that sits between the powder and the projectile. When the gun is fired, the powder pushes on the piston instead of the projectile, which pushes the projectile down the barrel and towards whatever political dissident is being targeted. That piston then seals in the opening of the brass shell, trapping all the gas inside, meaning that there's basically no sound of gunfire nor muzzle blast, and the only noise the gun makes comes from the sounds of the parts cycling, which is essentially just a light click. The OTS also fires off its bottom cylinder, with the area above the barrel housing an internal laser to help the shooter hit their target from close up without having to broadcast themselves as holding a gun by bringing it up to aim down the sights. The OTS was designed as an explicitly clandestine weapon, even to the point that its creation as a revolver was completely intentional, since revolvers don't eject spent shells like a semi-automatic. But obviously, if your target's a little farther away, a snub-nosed revolver isn't really designed to reach out and touch somebody, and that's definitely true for the OTS-38, which only has a maximum effective range of about 50 meters. Well, as you should be able to guess, the Russians have a gun for silently hitting targets from far away, but rather than just sticking a suppressor on the end of a sniper rifle and calling it good, they actually built the suppressor right into the barrel itself. As with most rifles created in Eastern Europe since a certain tractor mechanic decided that making a machine gun at the end of World War II was a good idea, the VSS Vintorez, or AS-VAL, is a dual-named gun based around the design of the AK-47. But despite having 2 different names and 2 different looks, both guns are identical in terms of mechanical design. Their cosmetic differences help them serve different purposes, with the AS-VAL intended to be more of an assault rifle, and the Vintorez designed to function as a sort of squad sniper rifle, but the biggest and really only difference is the buttstock and magazine size, although they can be technically used on either gun, so it's kind of debatable whether these can be considered as two different guns or just one gun with two different furnitures and two different purposes. Now, the gun came about in the late 80s from a need by the Spetsnaz for a rifle that was better suited for clandestine operations compared to the less adequate AKs with detachable suppressors they were using at the time. The gun was designed around a new 9x39 subsonic round that fires with a muzzle velocity of about 300 meters per second to an effective range of about a quarter mile. And yes, the Vintorez build is technically considered a sniper rifle, but the gun was built more as a multi-purpose weapon, and the higher stealth allowed by the internal suppressor makes up for the loss in range. The guns are still being used today by Spetsnaz and Russian military forces as a special purpose weapon, and it might actually surprise you to know that the US government didn't even know the gun existed for the first few years it was in use, which I guess means the gun kind of did its job. The last Russian gun I want to talk about for level 2 of the iceberg is the PP-2000, which is a compact submachine gun built as a PDW for Russian police. The gun operates on a very simple straight blowback design with the reciprocating charging handle placed above the barrel, very similar to the H&K G36. The PP-2000 is chambered for standard 9mm rounds, but it's also built to handle special ZN-21 and ZN-31 armor-piercing rounds that give the gun the penetration power similar to guns like the FNP-90 or the H&K MP7. Typical with many machine pistols, the PP-2000 has a folding stock for added stability, but this can actually be detached and replaced with a second magazine that acts as a much worse buttstock, but at least you can carry a couple extra rounds, I guess. There's been a couple different variants of the gun created over the years, including one with a absolutely massive flashlight mounted under the barrel, as well as a civilian version that turns the gun into more of a carbine, and while it hasn't really seen a whole lot of official or widespread use, the PP-2000 is actually one of the 2 approved submachine guns for use by the Russian law enforcement. And speaking of Russian submachine guns, you might recognize this next gun as the sidearm used by Colonel Strelnikov in the original Red Dawn movie. However, this gun is actually not even Russian, and it was in fact a stand-in for the PM-63, since a little thing called the Cold War made it pretty difficult to get Eastern European guns into the US at the time. This gun is the Finnish Jatimatic, which comes from its creator, Jari Tamari, who made an automatic gun. Very creative. If you look at the profile of the gun long enough, you'll probably notice that there's a few weird angles going on, and that's actually because the bolt reciprocates at a slight angle away from the barrel, diverting the recoil downward and allowing the shooter's hand to be more in line with the axis of the barrel. This makes shooting the gun much more stable to the point that it can even be fired one-handed with a little bit more control compared to a lot of other submachine guns. The angle the bolt travels when cycling also allows it to feed rounds directly into the barrel on its own, completely eliminating the need for a feed ramp to move rounds from the magazine to the firing chamber, because the bolt does it all on its own. Now, just like the PM-63 it stood in for in Red Dawn, the Jatimatic uses a 2-stage trigger rather than a selector to fire on semi and full auto. As a reminder, that just means that depressing the trigger halfway fires it once, and pressing it all the way fires it on full auto. The gun is charged by actually racking that folding foregrip, which thankfully does not actually reciprocate when firing, and it acts as a safety when folded by locking the bolt in place. But it also provides the shooter with some extra firing stability, obviously, which is good since the gun doesn't actually have any kind of buttstock built into it. But this was intentional since the gun was meant to be concealable as a quick deploy weapon for undercover police, and the gun is actually a pretty simple build, only being made up of just about 39 parts. Now, one kind of goofy but also kind of thoughtful feature is that the ejection port is always covered except for when a shell is actively being ejected, and this is because part of the bolt fills the opening both when forward and out of battery and when locked back and charged, with the words "fire" indicating that the gun is indeed ready to fire. Jari Tamari marketed his gun to Finnish police and border patrol in the early 1980s, but no one really seemed to have a need for them. And after a burglary at his factory resulted in about 20 of the guns being stolen, Tamari's manufacturing license was revoked and he sold his design to a new company who began producing the gun under a new name, but it flopped again. The gun went on to be featured in a few different movies in the 80s, but none of the guns were ever actually owned by armorers or prop houses of the filmmaking industry because they were actually on loan to the US directly from the manufacturing company as a sort of marketing gimmick so that the Jatimatic could become that one gun from the One American movie, and in a roundabout way, that's exactly what ended up happening. Guns in movies have obviously been a pivotal part of pop culture, and for a lot of people, the stuff they watch or play is what first gets them into guns. And if there's one thing that movies have taught us, it's that you should never do anything to the pet of a guy with guns. I know this is a really weird segue, but I had to find a way to talk about shooting animals without sounding like a total psychopath, so stay with me. If a vet wants to give a sick animal the Old Yeller Special, he can make it a little less traumatizing by making it a little quieter with the Brugger & Tomet VP9. It's directly inspired and sometimes mistaken for the Welrod pistol, which I covered on level 1 of the iceberg. Now both guns operate in very much the same way, but while the Welrod was designed for clandestine operations in World War II, the VP9 was actually designed for humane animal euthanasia, and VP9 actually just stands for Veterinary Pistol in 9mm. Now you might be wondering how putting down an animal executioner style is more humane than, say, an injection, but the VP9 is actually used for agricultural and hunting purposes when putting down a larger animal with an injection could be a lot more dangerous and costly. Like I said, the VP9 was built off of the Welrod, and in a lot of ways it's basically just a modernized version of it. It's got a very similar safety and trigger setup and fires on a bolt action mechanism operated by twisting a knob on the back. The suppressors are also similarly built, with the metal baffles offset by silicone wipes to better contain gases and block sound, but the VP9's doesn't perform quite as well as the Welrods, offering only about half the sound suppression and only being good for about 20 shots at most. Thankfully though, the VP9 suppressor is detachable and it can be easily replaced. Now the VP9 has pretty much stuck to its purpose as a pistol for putting down animals, and it hasn't actually seen any official military application. There are two variants of the VP9 made for the American market called the Station 6.9 and the Station 6.45, and these are marketed more as next-gen Welrods for tactical use, but these two don't really see a whole lot of use outside of just civilians plinking at the range. Now I want you guys to remember back to a time when you were a little kid. If I asked you to draw me the perfect gun for a pirate, chances are you'd probably draw something like this. Now yes, I did talk about guns combined with contact weapons already, but I feel that the Elgin cutlass pistol still demands mentioning, since its design was actually patented and was made for use by the US Navy. In 1827, James Bowie made a name for himself after killing a man in a duel using a massive custom-made hunting knife that came to be known as the Bowie knife. He would later die in the Battle of the Alamo while bedridden from illness, and according to legend, he went down fighting with his knife still in his hands. And I'm telling you all this because the Bowie knife was actually the inspiration behind George Elgin's design. Now basically, the idea that George Elgin had was to attach a Bowie knife to a percussion cap pistol, and there you go. The design is pretty simple, and the patent that Elgin submitted for the gun reflects this simplicity. All it pretty much says is, I'm George Elgin, this is the gun, I made the gun, it's got a knife on it. But would it surprise you to learn that the Elgin pistol was actually the first percussion cap firearm ever to see service in the US military? Well, it was. In 1838, the US Navy commissioned 150 of the guns to be issued to soldiers being sent on the Wilkes South Sea expedition, and they were indeed used by soldiers, such as in 1840, when a landing party was attacked by natives on the island of Malolo. As we've talked about before, getting guns to reliably hold and fire lots of rounds has been a continuous concern for gun engineers. And every time there's been a major advancement in gun technology as a whole, there tends to be a lot of super interesting yet very impractical designs, such as the Howell Automatic, which was a very early foray into the concept of a high-capacity self-loading rifle from the World War I era. It was built around a bolt-action Lee-Enfield rifle with an external mechanism built on to cycle rounds in a manner very similar to modern gas-operated rifles. The Howell Auto was apparently pretty reliable in field testing, but all the extra parts on the outside of the gun made it pretty unwieldy to use and quite prone to issues when exposed to battlefield conditions, so it wasn't super popular. And while pretty wacky looking by today's standards, the design of the gun is actually pretty well thought out for the time. A metal tube runs down the length of the barrel with a small gas port towards the muzzle that redirects gases into a spring-loaded piston inside. When the gun is fired, the piston pushes rearward on a curved metal cam slotted over the bolt, which cycles the action just as if it were being manually operated by the shooter. To account for all of these extra parts, a pistol grip and offset sights are added to the gun, and the gun was made to hold both 10 and 20 round magazines. A couple metal shrouds were also installed on the buttstock to protect the shooter's face and hands from the moving parts. The Howell Auto was shown off to British forces to give them an edge in trench warfare, but it was just too weird to be adopted into use. In the years leading up to World War II, the creator of the gun tried to push it onto the British Home Guard as a sort of anti-aircraft rifle, but they didn't really have much of a need for it either, and ultimately only a handful of Howell automatic rifles were ever made. Because one of the biggest needs for a gun designed for battle is that it can be efficiently and reliably used and carried by soldiers. When World War II came to an end, many different countries realized that high-caliber long rifles weren't going to be as necessary in the future, leading to the development of a lot of new submachine guns and carbines. This was also a time when a lot of militaries were standardizing what sort of ammunition they used, with many opting for 9mm as the go-to pistol round. One of the guns to be developed during this time was the Hotchkiss Universal. Now, Hotchkiss was a well-renowned French company that made a whole lot of guns used in both World Wars, but the company was actually started in the 1800s by an American named Benjamin Hotchkiss, who came to Europe after the Civil War, seeking to expand into a fresh market for his firearm design. That doesn't really have anything to do with the gun itself, since Benjamin was obviously very long dead when the Universal was created, but it's kind of still a very interesting tidbit about the company's history. Anyway. The Hotchkiss Universal was a closed-bolt blowback submachine gun built to replace the MAS-38 and was designed to be much more compact and portable by having nearly every major part of the gun collapse or fold down. The barrel telescopes into the frame, while the stock, pistol grip, and magazine well can all fold up to be easily stored or carried without taking up a whole bunch of extra space. The unfortunate downside was that all of those features made the gun pretty expensive to produce, as well as pretty mechanically complex to use and rather uncomfortable to shoot. This led to the gun struggling to find a whole lot of buyers in France, but a number of them eventually made their way to Venezuela, where they were used by military bodyguards during the coup to overthrow Marcos Pérez Jiménez in the 1950s. Now, I know I've said it more than enough times by now, but there is a huge market for personal defense firearms that allow a large ammo capacity in a small package, and that's been around since literally ever. But for a lot of years, people didn't just carry guns to fend off human attackers, because in the days before the rabies vaccine, the risk of being attacked by a rabid animal was a huge concern, and that's why there are a lot of old pocket pistols chambered for pretty puny rounds. These guns were more intended to scare off the animals rather than do any damage, because you didn't want to be left with a dead rabid animal and open yourself up to a whole lot of other diseases and risk attracting more wild animals. And in the case of pack animals like dogs, 1 or 2 shots may not have always been enough, and that's why revolvers and pepperbox derringers were so popular. But another gun made for this market was the Remington Ryder, designed by Joseph Ryder and manufactured in the late 1800s by, you guessed it, Remington Arms. It's a 5-shot repeater chambered in .32 extra short rimfire and uses a tube magazine under the barrel and a vertically shifting breech block to allow rapid successive fire, which is honestly pretty impressive for a pocket gun from that era. While not exactly the same, Remington Ryders operate using an incredibly scaled down mechanism that's not too unlike a lever action rifle. Fewer than 15,000 of these were made during its production, but it's one of the few American handguns made during this time that used tube magazines, and that's why it stands out most. But obviously, the king of pistols in the Old West was the tried and true single-action revolver, and what is more iconic, or at least an icon of internet culture, than the gun used by an Arizona Ranger to shoot an outlaw named Texas Red in the town of Agua Fria? No, the story told in the Song of Big Iron is not true, but did you know that the titular revolver was allegedly a real gun? According to legend, Marty Robbins saw the gun in a North Hollywood gun store called the Gunfighter, which was owned and operated by a guy named Andy Anderson, who was a famous cowboy action shooter, gunsmith, and leather craftsman who was known for his quick-fire holster rigs used in Western films by actors like Clint Eastwood, as well as various competition shooters. The gun that Robbins apparently saw was a custom-made, one-of-a-kind gun that was so cool that he just had to write an entire song about it. The gun was presumably bought sometime after by a private collector, and its current whereabouts are unknown. So, if you're watching this, guy who owns the Big Iron, please call me. Now, according to the information I could find, the gun that inspired the Big Iron was made up of parts from several different guns, taking the frame and cylinder from a .45 Colt single-action Army, the grip from a Colt 1860, and a 9.5-inch octagon barrel cut from a Marlin lever-action rifle. If one were to remake the Big Iron today, it would cost around $3,000 just to acquire the guns it was made from. A new production .45 Marlin goes for around $1,000, while a new production Colt single-action Army costs approximately $1,800, and a Colt 1860 reproduction typically goes for about $400. If you wanted to use authentic 1800s parts, first off, why would you want to deface a piece of history for a meme, but you'd also need to fork out some major cash, since antique Marlin rifles can go for at least twice the price of current models, and both types of Colt revolvers can run as high as $60,000 each. You'd also need the skill of a gunsmith who specializes in antique guns from the Wild West, which could also be pretty costly. However, a somewhat cheaper version could be made using reproduction models from other manufacturers. For example, a Rossi R92 rifle and a Ruger Vaquero are each around $900, and Pieta makes an 1860 reproduction for about $370. Now, it should go without saying that all of this is completely hypothetical, and no one should go modify or cut up and combine different guns unless you know exactly what you're doing and you're following all the necessary laws and regulations. You can land yourself in a lot of trouble, let alone seriously injure or kill yourself or someone else. Firearms should never be handled without proper training and should always be used in a safe way. But if you truly wanted to make a real big iron all on your own, you could easily get your start in gunsmithing and engineering by checking out the Sonoran Desert. Thank you all so much, everybody, for joining me on the second level of the Weird Gun Iceberg. I really appreciate all the love that the first video got, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this series. There's obviously still a lot of guns I have left to cover, so please make sure you're subscribed so you can keep up. I'd love to know which one of the guns from this group you liked best, and which ones you're most looking forward to in the lower levels of the iceberg. Until then, keep shooting for the stars, and I'll see you all back here next time. Goodbye, everyone.